The weeks following the Stash House raid had transformed Harlem into a powder keg. Everyone could feel it. The shopkeepers who pulled their gates down earlier than usual, the mothers who kept their children inside when the sun went down, the old men who had seen this before, decades ago, and recognized the signs. Something was coming, something that could not be stopped. Frank Lucas had been methodical in his response to Mitch's attack. He had dismantled Mitch's operation piece by piece, turning soldiers against their boss, cutting supply lines, eroding the foundation of everything Mitch had built. It was elegant, it was effective, and it was driving Mitch to desperation. Desperate men do desperate things. Frank knew this. He had counted on it even. But knowing something is coming and being ready for it are two very different things. 116th Street ran like a scar through the heart of Harlem. It was not the longest street, nor the widest, nor the most famous, but it had significance. This was the unofficial border between Frank's territory and what remained of Mitch's crumbling empire. Both sides knew it. Both sides respected it. Until that Thursday afternoon, when respect stopped mattering. The day started normally enough. Spring had finally arrived in the city, and people were eager to escape their apartments after the long winter. Children played on stoops. Music drifted from open windows. Vendors sold their goods from makeshift stands. Life, in all its ordinary beauty. Frank was not on 116th Street when it began. He was 3 blocks away, in the back office of a business he owned, reviewing numbers with his accountant. The meeting was routine. The numbers were good. Frank had no reason to think this day would be different from any other, but 6 of his men were on 116th Street. They were there for a meeting with a supplier, a neutral party who did business with both sides and preferred to keep it that way. The meeting was set for 3 in the afternoon, at a small restaurant that served as neutral ground. What Frank did not know, what none of his men knew, was that Mitch had learned about the meeting. One of the supplier's people had loose lips and looser loyalties. The information had made its way to Mitch's ears within hours. Mitch saw an opportunity. 6 of Frank's top men, all in one place at a predictable time. If he could eliminate them, it would cripple Frank's operation. It would send a message that despite everything that had happened, Mitch was still capable of striking back. It would restore his reputation among those who had begun to doubt him. So Mitch assembled his own crew. 8 men, veterans of the streets, men who had been with him from the beginning and had watched their empire crumble over the past weeks. Men who were hungry for revenge and willing to take risks to get it. They arrived on 116th Street at 2:45, 15 minutes before Frank's men were scheduled to meet with the supplier. They parked 3 cars at strategic points along the street, 2 at one end, 1 at the other, creating a box, a trap. And then they waited. Frank's men arrived at 2:55, 2 cars, 6 men. They parked in front of the restaurant and began walking toward the entrance. They were relaxed. This was supposed to be a simple business meeting on neutral ground. There was no reason to expect trouble. The first indication that something was wrong came from an unlikely source. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, who had been watching the street from his bedroom window. He saw the men in the parked cars, saw how they were positioned, saw one of them checking something under his jacket. The boy did not understand exactly what he was seeing, but he understood enough. He ran downstairs, burst out of his building, and sprinted toward the 6 men walking to the restaurant. Mister, he shouted, "Something is wrong! Those men in the cars! They are watching you!" What happened next unfolded in what witnesses would later describe as both an eternity and an instant. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, each second containing a lifetime of decisions and consequences. Frank's men understood immediately the positioning of the cars, the trap they had walked into. They had seconds to react. The street erupted. For 7 minutes, 116th Street became something out of a nightmare. The sounds of conflict echoed off the brownstones. Windows shattered. Car doors became shields. Civilians scattered in every direction, screaming, diving for cover, trying to understand what was happening to their quiet Thursday afternoon. Inside the restaurant, the supplier and his people hit the floor. The neutral ground was no longer neutral. It was the center of a storm that neither side had intended, but both had made inevitable. Frank's men fought back with everything they had. Despite being outnumbered and caught off guard, they held their position. The training that Frank had insisted upon, the discipline he had drilled into them, saved their lives in those chaotic minutes. 3 blocks away, Frank heard the distant sounds. At first he thought it was construction, a car backfiring, something ordinary. Then his phone rang. The voice on the other end was barely coherent. "Boss, 116th Street, they hit us, it is bad." Frank was in his car within seconds. His driver pushed through traffic, running lights, taking shortcuts through alleys. The 3 blocks felt like 3 miles. By the time Frank arrived, the street had fallen silent. The 7 minutes were over. What he found was chaos. Broken glass everywhere, cars riddled with damage, storefronts destroyed, and in the middle of it all, his men. 4 of them were standing. 2 were on the ground, being tended to by bystanders who had emerged once the danger passed. The injuries were serious, but not fatal. On the other side of the street, Mitch's crew had fared worse. Of the 8 men he had sent, 3 had fled when the tide turned against them. The rest were either injured or had been neutralized by Frank's men. The ambush had failed. Not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. Mitch had sent 8 men to eliminate 6. He had lost more than half of them, and he had done it in broad daylight, on a public street, with dozens of witnesses. Frank stood in the middle of 116th Street, surrounded by the aftermath. Police sirens were already audible in the distance. Soon this place would be swarming with authorities. Questions would be asked. Stories would need to be straight. But for this moment, Frank simply looked at the destruction around him. A woman emerged from a nearby building. She was crying. Her voice cut through the silence. "My boy." The boy who gave the warning. He had been caught in the crossfire. Not directly hit, but a piece of flying glass had cut him badly. He was being loaded into a car by neighbors who were rushing him to the hospital. Frank walked over. The woman looked at him with a mixture of recognition and fear. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who Frank Lucas was. "Is he going to be okay?" Frank asked. "I do not know," the woman sobbed. "He was just trying to help. He saw something and he ran out to warn those men." Frank reached into his pocket. He pulled out a roll of bills and pressed it into the woman's hands. "Take him to the best hospital, not the one on the corner, the one downtown. Use this for everything he needs, and when he is better you come find me. This boy saved the lives of my men. I do not forget that." The police arrived moments later. The street descended into the controlled chaos of an official investigation. Witnesses were questioned. Evidence was collected. Both sides knew better than to cooperate. The code of the streets was clear on this point. No matter what happened, no matter how bad it got, you did not talk to the authorities. In the days that followed, the story of 116th Street spread through Harlem and beyond. The specifics varied depending on who was telling it, but certain facts remained constant. Mitch had tried to ambush Frank's men. The ambush had failed. A young boy had become an unlikely hero. And Frank Lucas had shown, once again, that he took care of those who helped him. For Mitch, The failed ambush was more than just a tactical defeat. It was the final nail in the coffin of his reputation. The men who had remained loyal to him began to drift away. The territories he still controlled slipped through his fingers. Within a month, Mitch the King was king of nothing. But Frank knew better than to celebrate. The events on 116th Street had attracted attention, not just from the police, who increased their presence in Harlem dramatically, but from others. People in positions of power who had been content to let the streets handle their own affairs. Those people were now paying attention to Frank Lucas, and their attention was rarely a good thing. The boy who had given the warning recovered fully. Frank made sure of it. He paid for everything: the hospital bills, the rehabilitation, a new apartment for the family in a safer neighborhood. Some said Frank did it out of guilt. Others said it was calculated, a way to build loyalty in the community. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps, in the world Frank Lucas inhabited, those two things were not as different as they seemed. What remained certain was this: 116th Street had changed everything. The war with Mitch was effectively over, but the war had attracted new enemies. Enemies who operated on a different level entirely. Enemies who did not fight over street corners, but over something far more valuable. Next time on Frank Lucas Chronicles, Lenox Avenue, the night Harlem burned. When Frank's enemies decided that one street was not enough, they wanted to take everything, and they almost succeeded. That story is coming in part 6.